Hello everyone, this is Paul Higgins here, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar. It's great that so many of you could come and take part. This webinar is the second in the current series of webinars that we're doing. This one's called Introduction to Building Online Finance Marketplaces with the Crowd Valley API. For anyone who wasn't able to see the first of these webinars, which was done about a month ago, the first one was an introduction to building finance marketplaces more in general, and it covered a bit more about how to prepare for setting up a business in this area and this market. And you can see the slides and the video recording for that on our website. Similarly, this recording and the slides for this presentation will be made available. We'll send them out to everyone who registered for this webinar after the webinar is finished, so later today. And we'll also put the recording up on our website in a couple of days' time. So if anyone isn't able to stay for the whole session, then just go onto our website in a few days and you'll be able to see everything there. And any questions that come up, feel free to email me as well, and my email address is there on the screen. So this is our agenda for today. So I'll just touch on the kind of high-level purpose of the webinar and make sure that everyone is in the right place and expecting what we're going to be talking about. The bulk of the session, I'm just going to be talking about the structure and kind of architecture of the Crowd Valley Platform API, which is the kind of core API that we offer for building online finance marketplaces. I can just mention a few of the other Crowd Valley APIs and just sort of point to them and let you know that they exist as well, and I'll go into a bit more detail about that as well. And I'll run through the other kind of resources that are available to you to continue with your development work afterwards as well. We should have some time for some questions at the end, so you should be able to submit questions through the GoToWebinar software. I've got quite a few questions from people who got in touch in advance as well, so thank you to anyone who did that, and I'll try and run through some of those at the end. If we don't get time for your question today, then I'll try and follow up with anyone who got in touch in advance, or please just again feel free to email me and I'll follow up with you directly there. So this webinar is designed to be slightly more technical in the sense that we're not going to cover anything about the market or setting up a business in general in crowdfunding or peer-to-peer lending or these sorts of marketplaces. This is really going to be about how to start thinking about working with the Crowd Valley API. So we'll cover the kind of basics around how we handle authentication, what are the core objects and methods that our developers typically use, how to handle custom fields, which is one of the kind of most important elements of using any API, and then how to access third-party services which are plugged in and available through our API as well. We're not going to cover anything as detailed as code level examples today. I think we may go into that on future webinars. So at this stage, we're just going to be looking at some examples of typical processes that you would need to include in a finance platform, and then how to implement those processes using our API. So we would imagine that if you're attending, then you're probably either a developer yourself and you've been asked to build a site, or you're building a site for your own business, or perhaps a project manager, either a kind of technical project manager or a business project manager, who will be overseeing the development of these platforms. So that's the kind of audience that we had in mind. But of course, if you're more on the business side and you're interested in sort of learning more about how the API works, of course, you're very welcome as well. Just briefly about us at Crowd Valley, so we're a sort of API first company that provides this API and digital backend for running online finance marketplaces. So our customers are operating crowdfunding websites, real estate platforms, stock trading platforms, peer-to-peer lending platforms, and they all use the same API. They all use the same kind of admin backend. And so our experience has come from working with over 100 live sites now, and we've been in this industry for several years now, back to 2009. So this is kind of the main section that I want to cover today before we get into questions. So I'm just going to run through these one by one as we go through. So I'll kind of explain, first of all, the starting point, how you would sign up for Sandbox access. So I think many of you who submitted questions in advance have already gone through this process, and you've been working with our Sandbox already, so you may be quite happy with that, but I'll just cover that briefly. I'll talk briefly about how authentication, or what to expect from authentication, and then the core API endpoint. So what are the most important methods and functions and objects that you're likely to be working with if you're building a platform on top of our API. I'll mention a few of the other API objects and methods which are available privately as well. So these are not fully documented on our site at the moment, but they are available to you, and I can talk about how to access those. And then we'll run through how to handle custom fields, how to access third-party services, and then I'll just go through a few implementation examples with some real screenshots of some of our other customer sites, so that you can get a feel for how everything lines up together. Signing up then is very simple. If you go to our website, crowdvalley.com, there's a big sign up button in the top right hand side, and all you need to do is fill in your name and email address, and then that will be sent to our system, and we'll then follow up with you and set up a Sandbox account for you. So getting access is pretty easy. So if you haven't done that yet and you're just starting on that process, then please go to our website and sign up, and we will send you all the credentials that you need to start working with our API in Sandbox mode. Just thinking about Sandbox versus live and what we mean by those two systems. These are sort of very standard kinds of setups in software development, but you've got essentially two parallel product setups that we operate, that we maintain. So you've got the one on the left, which is the Sandbox kind of architecture, and then you've got the one on the right, which is for live use. And the databases and the processes and the users are entirely separate. So you would do all of your Sandbox testing and your development and your kind of preparation for launch on our Sandbox site using Sandbox API and Sandbox database. And then when you're ready to kind of move over to the live version, then you would be kind of using a fresh database. You'd be using a fresh live database. So thinking about how you would kind of use your Sandbox credentials, you would be setting up your own front-end site. So your own, that's this area here, that's your own front-end platform. So that's the site that your users would be spending their time in. You also have access to the Sandbox admin portal. So when you sign up for Sandbox through our website, then we will give you user credentials for accessing this Sandbox admin portal, and then you would do all your development work and your testing using those two systems, and then once you're ready, once you've kind of completed the development work on your front end and you're ready to go to the live version, then you would receive different credentials. You'd receive new credentials from us for the live database and live API. So the main kind of differences between the two are that in the sandbox version, our sandbox system doesn't send out any emails, so your users, since they're just test users, they don't receive any real emails, they don't receive any kind of notifications for things that are going on the site. So an example of a notification might be the email that you receive when you first register on the front end, for example. The sandbox version won't actually send out that email, but as a developer, you can see the list of emails that would be sent out if you're on live mode. Similarly, you don't get any kind of advanced analytics, so you don't get any market benchmarks and that kind of thing on the sandbox version. And on the live version, you can also do data exporting, and you get this kind of further analytics and this mailer function. But aside from that, the APIs are identical in both versions. So if you're building something that's using the sandbox API, then you'll know it will be also compatible with the live API as well. And so the sandbox and testing process can be done entirely for free. So that's you can use this site for as long as you want without paying us anything. And then when you go onto the live version, then you would have a subscription to our service at that point. The authentication process for using the API requires a couple of attributes that we send you when you sign up for Sandbox access. So when you first sign up through our website, then we will send you what we call a network name. So this is like your platform ID in our database. So think of this as your kind of customer ID or your single sort of site ID that that determines which database you're using on our backend. So whenever we create a new account for you, we're essentially setting up a new database for you to use, and this network name is your identifier for that database. We would also send you an API key and an API secret. So those are two strings. You can have as many API keys as you want, which can connect to the same database. So you may, for example, want to develop a web application and also a mobile application, for example, and you can request more than one API key connected to the same network, so that if you want to control which application, the web or the mobile application, has access, then you can use one API key for the web application and another API key for the mobile version. You can kind of use the API key system in that way, but in either case, you need to use the API key in the header when you're making a request to our API. The last thing that we'll send you is your own user email and password, and then this is also used as part of the header. So I'm not going to kind of go into too much detail about how the actual authentication process works, but you can go to our GitHub account, which is the link there that you see on the screen, and we have a couple of software development kits available there to anyone who wants to use them, and they are kind of fairly small pieces of code that will just take your network name, API credentials, and user credentials, and they will generate an authentication header for you, which you can then use to access our API. So all the instructions are there in GitHub if you want to have a look. But if you have any issues with that, then please get in touch and we can help you out there. So to go through the core API endpoints, so by this I mean the most important objects and the most important methods that your you're likely to use when putting together any kind of digital finance platform. So these are relevant whether you're building an equity crowdfunding site, or a business lending platform, or a real estate debt platform, or a kind of energy or solar kind of debenture platform. All those kinds of things, they essentially use the same kind of endpoints. The API follows REST principles, so you're accessing resources, as you can see in some of the examples on the right hand side. You're accessing some of the resources directly, and then we will return the relevant representation of those resources. All of the API methods use either get, patch, post, put, or delete. And as you would imagine, we kind of interpret those in the most relevant way for each method. So, for example, if you use the delete self option, that kind of represents to us that the user wants to remove their account from the system, and then so that doesn't actually delete their account from the database, it just marks them as expired, for example. So just to run through these 6 kind of main endpoints that you would usually need to use. So we've got self, which is the first one. So this is the logged in user's own account details. So all of the kind of functions that you would want to do as yourself, as the user, will be underneath this self endpoint. So, for example, the get self method would retrieve your own account information, your own user information. The patch self method would be for updating your own personal information. So if you wanted to change your address, for example, as an investor logged into one of these sites, then you would use that. And then you have a couple of kind of standard kind of user features, like forgot password and change password, for example, and then retrieving information related to your own activity. So getting your own investment. So that's getting the list of investments that you have made in the front end platform, and then getting your own organization. So if you're for example a fundraiser, then you might want to get a list of the companies that you're fundraising for. The user's endpoint is typically thought of as being for other users in the system. So you're logged in as an investor or a fundraiser, for example, and you want to see information about other users who's not yourself, but other users. So you can use the user's endpoint to retrieve lists of users and to retrieve information about an individual user. With the user's endpoint, it doesn't give you back all of the information that you would get about yourself. So, for example, if you're retrieving account information about yourself, then it would return a lot more. It would return, for example, some kind of private information that you submitted to the system in a way that wouldn't be correct to receive about other investors, other users. So you could set it up, for example, so that if you're using the self endpoint, it returns the user's passport number, for example, but if you're using the user's endpoint, it would just return the name and location and perhaps job title of the user, for example. And I'll go through a few kind of specific examples and screenshots of how these can be used in a few slides. Organizations is a kind of a generic entity type which should cover the entity that is fundraising on your platform. So an organization can represent a company, or it could be a fund or a property or a project. So in general, it's the thing that's doing the fundraising that creates the offerings for investors to make investments into. So an organization's fields are typically, you've got things like the organization name, and then location, and then other information about the organization. It might be kind of sort of business plans, or those sorts of things can be attached to organizations. So this endpoint is where you would set up the fundraising entity. And you can think about the relationship between users and organizations as well. So a user can have many organizations. So you might have a fundraiser user, for example, which is doing fundraising for several different organizations, perhaps a broker, for example. So you can create several organizations that have the same user as the kind of author of those organizations. And similarly, an organization can be associated with more than one user as well. So if you want to represent a team of people who are part of the organization, so for example, in the equity crowdfunding case, you might have an organization which is a startup, and then the startup has a management team. And so each of the management team can be represented by a user on the platform, and then all of those users, say 3 or 4 users, can be associated to one organization that's doing the fundraising. So you can have many-to-many relationships between users and organizations. Offerings is the funding round, if you like. It's the requirement to raise capital. So an offering must be associated and attached to an organization. So you can't have an offering unless it's attached to an organization. And so the offering is the object which contains information about the fundraise that you're trying to process through the system. So offerings would have attributes like funding goal, for example. You might have certain rules about how many investors you're allowed to have, or how many, or what the minimum investment would be for each offering. And so the offering contains all of that information. And in terms of the relationships, an organization can own more than one offering, but an offering can only have one organization. So an organization can run several offerings, several funding rounds. You might have one kind of seed stage round, one Series A round, one Series B round, and so on. And each of those would be represented by one offering, and each of those offerings would have the same organization. And then the next one down, investments. Investments is the commitment that's made by a user for an offering. So an investment would be essentially a kind of offer to the organization to participate in the funding round or the offering. So an investment must be made for an offering. So you can't make an investment kind of directly for an organization. The investment must be attached to an offering. The offering can have many investments. So again, in the crowdfunding case, you're often dealing with many investors for the same funding round. So an offering can have many investments, and an investment always has just one user. So an investment is made by a user for an offering. And then finally, documents. Documents is a type of object that can be used in many different ways depending on how you want to set up your funding processes. A document can be attached to any of the other objects here. So you can attach a document to users, to organizations, to offerings, or to investments, and you can tag the documents as well. So if you want to if you want to set up a front end process where you have say 5 documents that need to be reviewed by investors before you're able to close the funding round, then you can tag those documents by saying that this document 1 is a valuation document, document 2 is a business plan document, and then you can attach all of those to the offering, for example, or to the organization. So you've got a bit more flexibility in terms of how you want to use the documents object, and each of those are kind of written out in a bit more detail on our documentation page, which you can access from our website as well. So I'll go through a few examples because it's always easier to kind of get a sense of how these work with real screenshots and examples in a few minutes. So just to kind of summarize what we went through. So the self endpoint is typically for your own information as a user. So when you're logged in, this is your own information, and it can be attributes like personal kind of details or private details that only would be visible to you yourself as the user, and then also the admin user as well. Users themselves, so users who are other users that may be visible in the platform. This is often used for kind of public information, public profile information. So if you're setting up a platform where users can see other users, then you're likely to have this kind of public information on those profile pages. Organizations have attributes like display name, short description, credit score, these kinds of attributes that represent a company or a fund or a property, for example. Offerings is the fundraising offering, the offer that's made to investors. So this has attributes like funding goal, open date, close date, valuation. This is used the same way in equity cases and debt cases. So in equity cases, you would use the valuation attribute. In debt cases, you would use, for example, the interest rate and term attributes, but you're still using the same object. Investments, which are the offer made by a user to the organization, include things like the investment amount, so how much has been offered by the investor. It might include term and interest rate, or it might just be a plain investment amount. And then documents will have things like file name and file alias, which is a kind of public visible name for the document, description, file type, and so on. I'll just mention these kind of in passing, but these are some of the other API objects that you can work with through the platform API. And if these are kind of interesting or relevant to any of you, then you can get in touch with me afterwards and I can kind of explain these in a bit more detail. But these processes are also available through our API, and they're not currently published on our documents page, so they're kind of available privately, which means that that they're available to anyone, but you need to kind of come to us to get all the documentation for those at the moment. So if you're working with deal rooms, which are kind of private areas within a platform for a particular offering, which might contain, for example, a forum, like a question and answer forum for your users, or it might contain private documents that need to be accessed only by a certain kind of selected number of users, then you can set up that kind of functionality. Similarly, related to deal rooms, you can create user access groups and document groups. So if you want to manage on an individual document basis which users have access to which documents, then you can use those endpoints to manage that. Access requests. So again, if you want to control access to join an organization or to access a deal room, then instead of just allowing somebody to press a button and connect to that deal room or to that organization, you can run a process which requires access requests to be submitted and then either approved or rejected by a user. And then you have messages which are can be sent from users to other users, for example. So that's another function that I won't spend too much time on today, but is available. And then tasks as well. So particularly around deal rooms. In fact, if you want to set up a kind of due diligence checklist for investors to run through, and you want to be able to track which investors have completed which tasks in that checklist, then there is functionality around that as well that's also available. But please ask about that if you want to implement those features. I'll just talk briefly about handling custom fields, and then we'll go into some examples. There are two ways that we typically handle custom fields through our API. You can use an attribute called additional type, or you can use an attribute called custom information. So both of these are attributes that are available for all of the objects that we ran through before. So you can use these attributes on a user or an organization or an offering or an investment or a document, and you kind of use these in different ways. So the additional type attribute is typically used for kind of segmenting your objects into some way that makes sense for your platform. So in the case of a user, you might want to create some kind of categorization between users. So you might want to call some users an investor user and others a fundraiser and others an agent, for example. So you can use the additional type attributes to kind of create these categories, or you might want to kind of distinguish between individual and institution, for example, on the investor side. And so once you have created that additional type attribute, you can save that to a user's account in the database, and then you can use that status to determine how they can interact with your front end platform. So, for example, if you have a user who's logging in, you can check whether they are an investor or a fundraiser by retrieving their information and checking this additional type attribute, and then based on which one of those categories they fall in, you can point them to different pages on your site. So for an investor, you might direct them to a list of opportunities to invest in, and for a fundraiser, you might direct them to your kind of dashboard where you are keeping track of investor interest in your project, for example. Similarly, for organizations, you might want to split them into different categories, like commercial property versus residential property if you're in the real estate sector, or they could be things like splitting them into different types of projects, a fund or a business or a project. Or you could also think about organizations as representing investors or fundraisers as well. So you might want to set up those kinds of roles and attach those to an organization. Offerings, you can think about using additional type to represent a different stage of offering or a different type of share, for example, whatever makes most sense for you. For offerings, there's already support for secondary market offerings, so you don't need to use additional type to represent whether it's a primary or a secondary market offering. So there's a dedicated attribute already in the offering model that you can use for saying that this offering is a secondary market offering. And then investments, which are the investment made by an investor. You might want to create some categories for that, again using this additional type. And then the other way of handling custom fields is using this custom information attribute. And so custom information is a simple structure, a kind of key value pair, and you can use as many of these as you want attached to your object. So the custom information field will contain as many of these kind of custom attributes as you need to use. So these are always just plain text, all of these fields. So you don't really need to use these to represent, for example, date fields or numeric fields. Usually they are they're just plain text, but they can represent different things. So in the first example, we've got accreditation status. So you might want to represent that this user is a high net worth individual by giving the value 1 to represent that they have said that they are a high net worth individual. Or you might want to say for investment preferences that they have a preferred deal size of 50k to 100k, and that formatting is something that you would set up from your front end. For organizations, you might have things like a numeric value of number of bedrooms in the property case. You might have a kind of a category. So tax scheme could be one. So in the UK, you might have investments that are either EIS or SEIS offerings, and so you could use that kind of field to represent the type of tax scheme that's related to the to this organization. Or it could be a kind of longer text like market strategy. So if you're creating an organization profile page which has some longer field text, then you can use this key value structure to store that information. You can also store kind of HTML formatting in here as well. So if you want to use an HTML formatter on your front end, so that users can enter paragraphs and bullets and different formats like that, then you can use that, and then this structure would just save the HTML tags inside the text. And then a couple of other examples for offerings and investments that you can see, but I think the overall idea is that this is your kind of flexible way of adding any number of different types of custom information. And then there are also ways of accessing all of these sorts of third-party services. And again, I'm not going to go through this in too much detail, but I'll just point out that they are available. If you want to use any of these services, then please get in touch and we can help you to set up sandbox accounts for these. We have several dozen third-party services that cover these sorts of features, and all of these are accessible directly through our API. So to give one example, you might want to create a payments kind of credit card system as part of your online platform, so where a user could add money to their online wallet, for example. And one of our third-party services is a group called GSEN, which is Global Currency Exchange Network. They provide an online payments and escrow service, and so if you're using GSEN, then you can actually use these features directly through our API. So you're accessing the GSEN service directly through our API, through the user's endpoint or the self endpoint. In order to access these features, you would need to have an account set up with the third-party service provider. So these aren't available straight away out of the box, but if you do want to use any of them, then please let us know and we can help you get introduced to those people, and then you can set up your accounts that way and then start to use them through our API. So to go through some implementation examples, and then I'll have a bit of time for some questions as well. So these are some of the most common features that are part of many different types of funding platform: user registration, storing a kind of accreditation status, which could be part of a kind of full registration process of some sort, or a sort of authorization process. Viewing your own account, so having a kind of user profile page, retrieving the list of live offerings so that you can show the current opportunities that are available on your platform, viewing a single offering, so viewing all the detail around an offering, and then making an investment. So user registration, typically the very first step to register as a user would be something like this, so a kind of pop-up box which would be fairly short, maybe not asking too much information, and in this example, we've got 5 fields, 6 fields if you include the terms and conditions box. So you're just collecting the very basic information, and then that will create an account in our backend, in our database, and then you can allow the user to log in and continue the registration process. So you're using the post users function, and if you want to see the kind of exact syntax for this, then you can have a look on our website and look at the docs page, and everything, all the information is there. But the only required fields here are actually email and password, and then in this example, the platform has also asked you to provide your given name and family name, and also requested that you accept the terms and conditions. So just to kind of highlight that on the front end, which is the screenshot on the left hand side, you may not want to use given name and family name. You may want to use, for example, first name and last name, or first name and surname, for example. So that's entirely up to you. But then our API and our database will call them given name and family name, and that will be how they're represented in the data model. So if you've gone through that process as a user, you would have created an account. So you would have created a new user for yourself, and then you can use those credentials to log in. And a common kind of setup is that when the user logs in, you can do a check on the front end to see whether the user has completed certain required information for regulatory purposes, for example. So this kind of information, this investor kind of self-certification, which is quite common in some countries, this would be a good use of the custom information field. So that was the key value kind of structure that we went through just now. So you would, for example, create a key which could be something like user has self-certified as a high net worth individual, or self-certified investor, sophisticated investor. So you might have a single field which is something like is high net worth individual or is sophisticated investor, and then you could also have separately another field in the custom information attribute called I am a member of a network, or I have made more than one investment, or whatever it is. So you can store as many of those fields as you want, as is kind of required for you. And then in terms of the kind of user process, you might want to check that flag every time a user logs in, and then if they haven't completed that, if they don't have anything saved in that attribute, then you can redirect them to a page like this one, where they will be forced to submit this information. So that uses the patch self method. So that's because you're updating your own account. You're updating your own account represented by the self endpoint. The next one is so viewing your own account, so viewing your own user profile. So this uses the get self endpoint, and as you'd imagine, this just retrieves all of the information that you have submitted, and on the front end you can then decide how to lay it out and which information should be shown to the user. You can also think about which information should be kind of editable for a user. So it's quite common, for example, that a user would be able to edit their phone number, but they might not be able to edit their name, for example. So if they've gone through the accreditation process and they have submitted certain information that you have used to decide whether you want to allow them in, then you can prevent them from editing that information from the front end. So this is typically a page that the user would see about themselves. Retrieving live offerings. So this is, as you'd imagine, the get offerings function, and this can be used for retrieving the list of published offerings in the system. So we haven't talked too much about the kind of life cycles of these objects, and I think that will have to be a topic for another webinar. But if you use the get offerings function, then the API will give you back all of the offerings that have been published, so basically approved by the admin team. So you don't need to worry about kind of filtering which offerings are still in a draft status or which have been rejected or kind of cancelled or archived. If you use the get offerings feature, then you just retrieve the list of offerings that have been published and accepted. So that's how you would populate a page like this one, for example. This is a real estate example, which shows a list of all of the offerings that are currently fundraising, and it will show you the funding goal, in this case, the term, dividend yield, and so on. You can also use the get offerings function to manage filtering, searching, and sorting as well. Again, we won't go through that today, but you would be able to retrieve the correct offerings based on the filters on the right hand side through the API, and there's more information on that in the documents page on our website. Viewing an offering, so this could be an example of a kind of organization profile page or an offering profile page which provides all of the information about the opportunity. So this is the get offerings and then offering ID function. So you would typically, as an investor, you might start at the get offerings page, which shows you the full list, and then you might click on one of them, and then the front end would call this API method to retrieve the detailed information about this particular offering. And here you might have some standard fields like the name. So in this case, Project Alpha would be the display name of the organization, and then several kind of custom fields as well. So this one has things like deal type and sector focus and geographic focus and so on. So those are easy to customize through the custom info field. And then finally, making an investment. So this is a post instruction which goes to the offerings and then offering ID and then investment endpoint. This kind of makes it clear that an investment has to be attached to a particular offering. If you want to have a kind of pop-up box like this one where an investor would enter the amount they're interested in investing and then pressing an invest button, then you'd be calling the post investment endpoint at the top. The investment amount field is actually optional, so if you want to set up a way of allowing users to just kind of indicate interest, they can actually make an investment without an amount, and that could be used to represent the idea that this investor is just expressing interest in your offering. But typically you'd include the investment amount, and then you might also have some other fields like number of shares, for example, could be one, or any kind of follow-up information that might come from the investment. As a kind of final couple of points, and then I'll go on to some questions, there are other Crowd Valley APIs which I'm not going to talk about today, but I just wanted to flag up that they are available. If you're looking to do anything a bit more detailed in payments or identity, especially around KYC and anti-money laundering, content management, which is really if you want to include front-end content or blog posts, or you want to manage images through our API, then there is a content management service that you can use. So you shouldn't need to have a kind of separate like a WordPress site, for example, to manage your blog. You can have everything contained within the one API, and then you can do things like tracking which investors have seen which blog posts and things like that, all through the same system. We're also developing additional functionality around loan management and risk management. So loan management, which would be calculations of interest rates and loan to value calculations and repayment schedules, those sorts of things for managing loans, and then risk management, which is especially kind of critical in say the real estate world, or the kind of debt management platforms where you have a portfolio that you're managing and you want to see the kind of the risk of your portfolio as a platform. So if anyone wants more information about those, please get in touch and I can send some more information your way. And then finally, just to point out a few other resources, obviously our website is a good place to start for many things, as well as all the documentation and signing up for sandbox access. There's also a lot of information about regulations and research and other similar materials. If you want to have a look at the webinar that we did a month ago, then that's still available. And as I said at the beginning, the recording of this will also be made available shortly. We're going to do the next webinar in a month's time, Wednesday the 11th of November. It'll be at the same time of day, so 4 p.m. British Standard Time and earlier in the US. And this is going to be focused specifically on real estate platforms, so how to kind of configure the API with real estate platforms in mind. And it's going to go into a bit more detail about how to work with the admin site. So it's primarily for developers and technical project managers again, although of course anyone interested in this sector is very welcome as well. And then Funding Themes Hub is a source of front-end templates for all of these platforms, which are available for free. So if you want to start from an existing front-end site, then have a look there and get in touch if you want to start building with those. So there have been a few questions sent in, so thank